July 14, 1944, Berlin, Germany. The summer air hung heavy over the city, thick with the scent of coal smoke and the faint tang of gunpowder from distant fronts. Inside the walls of the Bendler block, the headquarters of the German Army's General Staff, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg moved with a quiet intensity. Reports from the Eastern and Western fronts lay scattered across his desk, detailing losses and retreats that weighed heavily on the officers around him. War had long ceased to be a distant reality. It was now a relentless, grinding presence that shaped every decision. Stauffenberg, recently returned from North Africa with a wounded hand and blinded eye, leaned over the maps, his fingers tracing troop movements, plotting courses that could not reverse the inevitable, but perhaps could alter the fate of Germany. His loyalty to the fatherland had never wavered, yet his conviction that Hitler's leadership was destroying the nation burned fiercely. Colleagues later recalled the precision in his planning, the methodical cadence of his voice when he spoke to generals and aides about the urgent need for decisive action. The plot was not born in isolation. It was the culmination of years of disillusionment among officers who had once pledged unwavering loyalty to the Führer. Within the circle that included General Ludwig Beck, Major General Henning von Tresckow, and other senior officers, debates had grown into shared resolve. Hitler's decisions were no longer just misguided, they were catastrophic. Supplies were stretched thin, the Eastern Front was collapsing, and the Allies' advance from Normandy threatened the very heart of the Reich. In confidential meetings, they discussed removing Hitler, not for personal gain, but to salvage Germany from utter destruction. Stauffenberg, aware of the stakes, began preparing for the decisive act. On July 14th, he received intelligence that Hitler would be present at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia for a series of strategic briefings. The opportunity was rare and the risk immense. Using his position as Chief of Staff in the Reserve Army, Stauffenberg meticulously arranged for a visit, carrying with him a briefcase concealing a small explosive device. Every detail, from the timing of the briefing to the placement of the bomb, was scrutinized against official schedules and floor plans of the Wolf's Lair conference room. The day was punctuated by moments of ordinary military routine, officers filing in, reports being read, messengers delivering orders. Yet beneath this veneer, Stauffenberg's mind raced. He noted the placement of colleagues around Hitler, the strength of the bomb's casing, and the estimated blast radius. Eyewitness accounts later described him as composed, even calm. Yet there was an intensity in his gaze that spoke to the gravity of what was about to unfold. Every step of his plan had been rehearsed, every contingency calculated. Failure was not an abstract possibility, it was almost certain. And yet, he moved forward with measured resolve. By the evening of July 14th, final preparations were in place. Orders were drafted to coordinate a parallel coup in Berlin, should the assassination succeed. Communications were arranged with conspirators in key military districts. The framework for a new command structure was poised to activate, ready to replace the Führer with a provisional authority that could negotiate an end to the war. Stauffenberg, despite his injuries, handled each task with disciplined precision, embodying the seriousness of the mission while remaining acutely aware of the personal cost. July 20th, 1944, Rassenberg, East Prussia. The morning dawned over the dense Masurian forests, a muted sun filtering through thick mist. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily fortified headquarters, the hum of staff activity filled the air. Guards patrolled the perimeters, vehicles rumbled along narrow gravel roads, and couriers carried messages between command posts. It was a day like any other in the compound, a carefully orchestrated routine designed to protect the Führer. Yet for Stauffenberg, every sound and movement was magnified, each moment weighed with significance. Dressed in his army uniform, medals polished, and briefcase in hand, Stauffenberg approached the conference room with deliberate calm. Witnesses later recalled that he spoke briefly to colleagues, maintaining an air of normalcy while internally measuring every risk. The briefcase concealed a small, time-delayed explosive device, engineered with precision and intended to detonate during the briefing. Inside, Hitler and his senior staff gathered around the long oak table, discussing military operations on both the Western and Eastern fronts. Generals, ministers, and aides sat shoulder to shoulder, their voices carrying the authority of the Reich. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase near the center of the table, aligning it carefully with Hitler's position, then excused himself, citing other duties. Every step followed the meticulous plan he had rehearsed over the preceding days. The explosion occurred minutes later, though not exactly as intended. The briefcase, inadvertently moved behind a heavy table leg, absorbed much of the blast. Papers and debris flew across the room, a shockwave rattling windows and shattering glass, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. Others nearby were wounded, some seriously, yet the Führer emerged, largely unscathed. Outside the conference room, the sound of the blast reverberated through the compound. Guards and staff rushed to the scene, confusion and alarm spreading quickly. Back in Berlin, the conspirators awaited confirmation. Messages relayed over coded channels carried incomplete or misleading information. Rumors swirled about the outcome, and for a brief moment, hope flickered that Hitler had been eliminated. In reality, the meticulous plan had faltered due to small, uncontrollable variables, a slight change in the table's positioning and the unpredictable nature of explosive force. Stauffenberg, unaware that the assassination had failed, prepared to return to Berlin and activate the broader coup. As Stauffenberg flew back to the capital, the tension was nearly unbearable. Airplanes hummed over the fields, the landscape a blur of forests, lakes, and villages. While he contemplated the next steps, Berlin would rise or fall based on the timing of communications and the execution of orders. But the margin for error was razor thin, and the fate of the plot now hinged on information that would arrive too late. By the evening, reality struck. Hitler was alive, the coup could not proceed, and the Gestapo had begun rounding up conspirators. Stauffenberg, along with key figures in the plot, was arrested at the Bendler block. Eyewitness accounts describe him as calm but resolute, fully aware that his actions had set the final course of his life. Within hours, the consequences of the day's events unfolded with swift and unyielding precision. July 20th, 1944, Berlin, Germany. The streets around the Bendler block were tense, the city holding its breath as word of the assassination attempt rippled through military and civilian circles. Inside the headquarters, Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators were escorted under strict guard to secure rooms. The atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken understanding. The hours ahead would decide their fates, and no detail could shield them from the repercussions of opposing Hitler. Accounts from officers present describe Stauffenberg's demeanor as composed, even stoic. Despite the knowledge that the plot had failed, he maintained discipline, offering no attempt at evasion. The Gestapo and loyal army officers moved quickly, gathering evidence and questioning those connected to the plan. Every document, every phone call, and every encounter with colleagues became part of the investigation. Within a few hours, the network of conspirators was mapped, and arrests spread through Berlin with methodical precision. At 10 p.m., Stauffenberg and his closest co-conspirators were informed of their imminent execution. They were led to the courtyard of the Bendler block, where a brief but formal military procedure awaited. Eyewitnesses later recounted that Stauffenberg showed remarkable composure, accepting the reality of the situation with quiet dignity. As he stood, his posture straight, the weight of the mission he had undertaken and the values that guided him were evident in his calm demeanor. The execution was carried out by a firing squad, a swift and direct action to prevent any further resistance or attempts to rally support. Stauffenberg's final moments were marked not by panic or pleas, but by the quiet resolution of a man who understood the consequences of his choice. Around him, other officers met similar fates, their names later memorialized in historical records documenting the most famous act of internal resistance within Nazi Germany. And the aftermath, the Bendler block became a symbol of both bravery and the peril of opposing totalitarian power. The Nazi regime used the failed plot as propaganda, showcasing the swift punishment of traitors and reinforcing loyalty among remaining officers. Yet, for those who had followed Stauffenberg's plan, and for historians later chronicling the events, the significance of the July 20th plot was profound. It demonstrated that within the heart of the German military, dissent had existed, and individuals had been willing to risk everything to alter the course of their nation. The night stretched on, Berlin quiet but charged with tension. Across the city, families awaited news of their loved ones, unaware of the precise outcome. Military commands recalibrated, orders reissued, and the machinery of the Reich pressed forward, seemingly unchanged on the surface. Beneath the veneer of routine, however, the courage of a small group of men left an indelible mark, a reminder that even within an oppressive system, acts of conscience could not be entirely extinguished. July, August 1944. Berlin and across Germany. In the days following the failed assassination, the Nazi regime moved with ruthless efficiency to suppress any trace of dissent. The Gestapo launched a comprehensive investigation that reached far beyond the Bendler block. Officers, civil servants, and even civilians with the slightest connection to the July 20th plot were interrogated. Many were arrested, some executed, and others imprisoned in concentration camps. Records later show that the purge extended to over 7,000 individuals, with approximately 4,980 sentenced to death. The aim was clear: eradicate opposition and send an unmistakable message of loyalty and fear. The German military, shaken by the audacity of officers within its own ranks, underwent immediate restructuring. Hitler personally reviewed key appointments, replacing commanders whose loyalty was even remotely questionable. The reserve army, which had been central to the plot's execution plan, was placed under strict surveillance. Units in Berlin and across occupied territories were reoriented toward defensive operations, with command carefully centralized to prevent any repetition of internal dissent. Historians later noted that these actions significantly tightened Hitler's control over the Wehrmacht, leaving little room for autonomous decision-making among officers. For Stauffenberg's co-conspirators, the consequences were swift and severe. Figures such as General Ludwig Beck, Major General Henning von Treschow, and Lieutenant Werner von Haeften became immediate targets. Beck, who had long opposed Hitler's aggressive strategies, was executed after refusing to recant his opposition. Haeften, Stauffenberg's aide, was executed alongside him in the Bendler block courtyard. Every action taken by the regime was documented in meticulous detail, leaving a historical record that continues to inform scholars about the inner workings of Nazi reprisals. Yet amid the repression, the July 20th plot left an enduring legacy. Within Germany and later in historical memory, it came to symbolize the moral courage of those willing to act against a totalitarian regime from within. Scholars highlight that, despite its failure, the plot demonstrated the presence of conscience and principle in a military environment dominated by strict hierarchy and obedience. Letters, diaries, and testimonies collected after the war reveal that contemporaries viewed Stauffenberg and his colleagues as embodying a difficult but principled form of resistance, one that risked everything for the possibility of altering the course of history. Meanwhile, the broader war continued unabated. The Allies advanced from Normandy and Soviet forces pressed from the east, but the internal dynamics of the German military had shifted subtly. Commanders became more cautious, less willing to challenge directives, and increasingly focused on survival rather than strategy. Hitler, emboldened by the failure of the coup, reinforced his leadership style with even greater authoritarian control. In practical terms, the failure of July 20th solidified the regime's grip on Germany, but it also etched a narrative of bravery and moral clarity into the historical record, an enduring testament to what might have been. July 1944, post-war reflections in the years following the war. The story of Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg and the July 20th plot became a central narrative in understanding German resistance to Nazism. Stauffenberg's actions, once labeled treasonous by the Nazi regime, were later recognized as acts of profound moral courage. His willingness to confront the machinery of dictatorship, fully aware of the mortal risk, has been preserved in military records, memoirs, and extensive historical scholarship. Historians note that the significance of the plot extends beyond the immediate failure to assassinate Hitler. It revealed that within the heart of the German officer corps, dissent had persisted, driven by conscience rather than self-interest. Interviews with surviving witnesses emphasized the meticulous planning, the disciplined execution, and the personal bravery that defined Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators. Even in failure, they demonstrated that organized resistance was possible in the most controlled and surveilled of environments. Monuments and memorials in Berlin now mark the Bendler block, honoring the men who acted with conviction. Schools, books, and documentaries recount the events of July 20th, teaching future generations about the intersection of duty, morality, and courage. Letters and diaries preserved in archives reveal the human dimensions of the plot, personal fears, quiet determination, and the weight of responsibility carried by officers who chose principle over safety. These accounts provide insight not only into military strategy, but also into the ethical challenges faced by individuals under totalitarian rule. The narrative of Stauffenberg also invites reflection on the fragile line between success and failure in history. Small, uncontrollable variables, the placement of a briefcase, a slight delay in communication, can alter the course of events, with consequences that ripple across decades. Yet, the enduring lesson is clear. The courage to act, even when the odds are insurmountable, shapes moral memory and inspires generations. For Stauffenberg and his colleagues, the July 20th plot was both the culmination of years of conscientious opposition and a testament to the capacity for individual agency in the face of overwhelming power. Today, as visitors walk the courtyards of the Bendler block or read first-hand accounts from those involved, the story resonates with the same immediacy and gravity as it did in July 1944. The echo of choices made, lives risked, and principles upheld serves as a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, acts of conscience endure, guiding, inspiring, and challenging future generations to consider what it truly means to act with courage and conviction.